Abigail Whitaker knelt in the dust with a dead man's feed bucket in her hands and held it out to a stallion that should already have been a corpse. "Easy now," she whispered. "If you made it this far, I won't let you fall at my gate." She did not know that by sunrise, 200 ranchers would surround her land to take that horse and everything her husband had died for. If you believe a woman's worth can never be bought, subscribe and stay with me to the very end. And tell me in the comments what city you're watching from, so I can see how far this story travels. The bucket was almost empty before Abby admitted to herself what she was doing. She had carried it out to the fence, telling herself she only meant to look. A wild horse in a drought year was trouble, and she had trouble enough. But her feet had carried her past the gatepost, and her knees had found the dirt, and now the stallion's breath was warm and ragged against her wrist, and she could no more walk away from him than she could walk away from her own pulse. "You're not eating fast enough to be wild," she murmured. "Somebody had you once?" The stallion's ribs stood out like the rungs of a ladder. One foreleg was torn open above the knee, the wound packed with grit. His eyes never left her face. Burrs hung in his mane like he'd run through every mile of bramble between here and the Pecos. "All right," she set the bucket down and let him finish. "All right, I hear you." She did the next part without letting herself think. She cleaned the leg with rainwater from her own barrel water. She could not spare water that was worth more than money this summer, and she talked the whole time low and steady, the way Thomas used to gentle the colts. "My husband would have called me a fool," she told the horse. 2 years gone, and I'm still hearing his voice telling me how to do things. She wrung out the cloth. He'd be right too. He usually was. About horses anyway. She left the back of the barn open so the stallion would not feel penned, and she sat against the wall and watched him breathe until the dark went gray. Something in her chest that had been folded shut for 2 years started very slowly to come loose. She didn't trust it. She'd learned not to trust anything that felt like hope. She had almost dozed when the ground began to talk. Not thunder. She knew thunder. This was steadier, deeper a sound that came up through the dirt and into her teeth. Hooves. A great many of them. And under the hooves, the groan of wagon wheels. Abby was on her feet before she'd decided to stand. She went to the porch with the lantern still in her hand, though it was past dawn, and she stopped dead at the top of the steps. They were strung along her fence line as far as she could see. Riders, wagons, men she'd sat beside in church, and men she'd never laid eyes on. The water wagons caught her first 3 of them big iron-banded tanks, and the sight of that much water made her mouth go dry by reflex. At the front, on a tall gray, sat Silas Rourke, and he was smiling at her the way a man smiles at a field he already knows the yield of. "Morning, Mrs. Whitaker," Silas called. Abby did not answer. She counted instead. She got to 100 and stopped because counting past it didn't change anything. "We heard," Silas said, "that you took in something last night that doesn't belong to you." "News travels fast for a drought," Abby said. "I'd have thought folks had better things to do than watch one widow's fence." A few of the men laughed. Silas didn't. He swung down off the gray slow and easy, a big soft man who had never once in his life had to hurry. "That black stud," he said. "He's stolen stock. Got a brand on him belongs to nobody decent. You take in a stolen horse that makes you a receiver. You know what that is, ma'am? I know what you'd like it to be. Now?" He spread his hands, the picture of patience. "I came to do you a kindness. You hand that horse over before noon, and I'll see the county forgets all about the back payment on your water lease. Clean slate. A woman alone this kind of summer, you ought to be glad somebody's looking out for you." There it was. Abby felt it land in her stomach like a cold stone. The water lease. She made herself keep her voice level. "I paid my lease in the spring. Thomas paid the one before that. There's no back payment." "There's a notice says otherwise." Silas nodded, and a thin man in a town coat came forward and held up a paper. "Filed proper. You'll find the county's very particular about its records." "The county," Abby said, "is particular about whatever you tell it to be particular about." That stopped the laughing. She stepped down off the porch. She was a small woman, and she knew it, and she knew exactly how she looked to 200 men, like the last thing standing between them and an easy morning. She walked to her own gate and put her hand on it and did not open it. "Sheriff Doyle," she said, because she'd found him in the crowd. "You're a long way from town for a fence dispute." Doyle wouldn't meet her eyes. He was a decent enough man on an ordinary day, and an ordinary day was the only kind he had courage for. "Abby," he said, "best not make a war over a horse. I'm not the one brought 200 men and a court paper to my gate before breakfast, Sheriff." She let that sit. "Which one of us is making the war?" Doyle's jaw worked. He looked at Silas, and Silas looked back at him with the mild, patient face of a man who owned the note on the sheriff's house, and Doyle looked at the dirt. That told Abby everything. "Mrs. Whitaker." Silas came closer, lowering his voice now, making it just for her the way men did when they wanted you to feel they were on your side against the very crowd they'd brought. "I'll be honest with you, plainer than I've been. This land's too much for you. Everybody here knows it. You're behind on near everything a person can be behind on. Your north fence is down in 3 places. Your hands quit you. The bank in town won't carry you past September, and I know that because I sit on the bank." He smiled, gentle as a preacher. "I'm not your enemy. I'm the only man in this county willing to take the burden off your shoulders before winter does it the hard way." And the terrible thing, the thing Abby hated, was that part of her wanted to believe him. The tired part. The part that had buried Thomas in the dry creek bed 2 years gone, and had been carrying the whole place alone ever since every gate and every calf and every empty side of the bed. "You want the horse," she said slowly. "Or you want the ranch." Silas's smile didn't move. But something behind his eyes did just for a breath, and Abby saw it, and she felt the cold stone in her stomach turn into something harder. "Hand over the horse before noon," Silas said, "and we'll talk about the rest like reasonable people. And if I don't, then I reckon the county's records will get even more particular." He stepped back easy again, the kindness all gone now that it had failed. "And those 3 water wagons there, that's the only water headed to Whitaker Flats this month. You understand me? I control the wells north of here, the lease south of here, and the bank that holds the rest. You've got a barrel of rain and a dying horse." He let it land. "Noon, Mrs. Whitaker. That's generous, and you know it." He turned to go. And Abby, who had meant to hold her tongue, who had promised herself she'd be smart, heard her own voice come out of her clear and carrying across 200 silent men. "My husband knew this land better than any man here," she said. "He bought the East 40 when the lot of you laughed at him for it, called it worthless scrub, said he'd thrown his money in the dust." She lifted her chin. "And now the richest man in the county's brought an army to my gate over it. So which one of you was the fool, Silas?" The silence after that was a different kind of silence. Silas Rourke stopped with his back to her. When he turned around, the gentleness was gone clean out of his face, and what was underneath it was the thing Abby had always known was there. "Be careful," he said quietly. What a widow says out loud. He mounted up. The water wagons rolled back deliberate, so she'd be sure to watch them take the water away. And then they left her all but a handful of men Silas posted at the corner of her property, sitting their horses by her, well watching counting. Abby went back to the barn. Her hands were shaking, and she let them because there was no one to see. The stallion was on his feet. "You hear all that?" she asked him. Her voice cracked on it. "You hear what you walked me into?" The horse blew out a long breath and pressed his nose against her shoulder, and Abby stood there and let an animal lean on her because there was nothing else in the world that would. It was past midday before anyone came who wasn't there to take something from her. She heard the single horse and reached for the old rifle by the door before she saw the man, and she kept it in her hands when she did. He came up the road slow, both palms loose on the reins, so she could see them, a working cowboy with sun-cracked skin and a sweat-dark hat and a coat that had been mended more times than it had been bought. He stopped well short of the porch and touched the brim of his hat. "Ma'am?" "You with Rourke?" The man went still. Something crossed his face, shame quick and deep, like she'd touched a wound. "I was," he said, "years back. I'm not now. He paused. Name's Caleb Mercer. I came because of the horse. Everybody's come because of the horse. Not the way I have. He looked past her toward the barn, and whatever he saw there changed him. He swung down without asking, and crossed to the rails before she could tell him to stop, and he stood looking at the stallion's torn leg, at the burr-clotted mane, and at the brand on the animal's shoulder. 3 slanted lines running down to meet at a single point. Lord, Caleb said softly, it's really him. You know that, Mark. I know what it means. He turned, and his eyes were different now, urgent. Ma'am, the families that run free horses west of the Pecos, they brand like that. And the stories say their horses can find water. Deep water. Water nobody else can smell. He took a breath. Rourke's been hunting a horse with that brand for the better part of a year, tearing the county apart for it. Folks thought he'd gone simple. Abby felt the ground shift under her like the dry creek bed shifting under Thomas. The East 40, she said. Ma'am? My cattle drift there in the worst of the heat. Every year, the grass stays green when everything else burns off. Thomas always said. She stopped. She put her hand against the porch post to steady herself. Thomas always said there was something under that ground. Caleb's face went pale under the sunburn. Then that's it, he said. That's why 200 men rode out for one horse. He shook his head slowly. He doesn't want the stallion, ma'am. He never did. The horse'll lead anybody who knows how to read him straight to the water. And the water's already under your land. He wants the East 40. The horse is just how he proves where to dig. Abby lowered herself onto the step. She'd thought she understood the danger. She hadn't understood the half of it. Then I don't have until autumn, she said. I have until he figures out he doesn't need me to sign anything at all. No, ma'am, Caleb said quietly. You don't. She looked up at him, this stranger who'd ridden for the very man trying to break her, who carried something behind his eyes she hadn't earned the right to know yet. Why are you telling me this? She asked. If you rode for him? Caleb took his hat off then. He held it in both scarred hands and turned it slow, and when he spoke, his voice was rough as the wire she could see had cut his palms 100 times. Because I helped him do this to somebody once, he said. A widow like you. Different county. I drove the cattle across a line that wasn't true and looked the other way while he took everything she had. He swallowed. I've been riding away from that for 6 years, and I reckon a man only gets so many chances to stop riding away. A long quiet sat between them, broken only by the stallion shifting in the barn. Mr. Mercer, Abby finally said. Caleb, if it's all the same. Caleb. She stood up off the step and squared her small shoulders against everything that was coming. You ought to know what you're staying for. He's cut my water. The town won't sell to me. The sheriff won't help me. By tonight I'll have a wounded horse, an old man with a bad leg, a boy too poor to know better, and you. And the richest man in Texas wants me gone. She looked him dead in the eye. Most men would have kept riding. Caleb put his hat back on. He stepped forward, one slow, deliberate step, putting himself between her and the road where Rourke's men still sat their horses by her well, and the gesture said more than any words could have. Then I reckon, he said, I picked a fine day to stop being most men. Out at the corner of the property, one of the watchers turned his horse and rode hard for town to carry word back that the widow hadn't folded. And on the ridge to the north, too far for Abby to see, but not too far to feel shadows on horseback, had been sitting still as stone since dawn, watching a woman who didn't yet know she wasn't alone. The rider who'd galloped for town came back before sundown, and he didn't come alone. Abby was hauling the last of her rain barrel to the stallion when she heard the wagons on the road again. Not the great army of the morning, just 2 riders and a buckboard. She set the bucket down, and Caleb came around the barn at her shoulder, and she noticed he'd already shifted, so his body was between her and the road, without seeming to think about it. It was Silas's foreman, a lean man named Del Pruitt, and beside him on the seat was the man from the bank in the town coat, Mrs. Whitaker. Pruitt didn't get down. Got papers for you. Set them on the post, Abby said. I'll read them when I've a mind to. Best read them now. Pruitt held out a folded sheet. and when she didn't move, he let it drop in the dirt at the foot of her gate. That there's a notice. County's calling in the back lease. You got 30 days, or the water rights revert. After that, anybody drawing from your own well's a trespasser. He smiled thin. Including you, ma'am. My well sits on my land. Your well draws from the aquifer the county leases. Read the paper. Pruitt's eyes slid past her to Caleb, and the smile went cold. Mercer, didn't take you for a fence post kind of man. Mr. Rourke know you're here. He will, Caleb said. He surely will. Pruitt clucked to his team. You always did pick the losing side, Caleb, even back when you rode for the winning one. He turned the buckboard. 30 days, Mrs. Whitaker, though I expect you'll be gone long before. Abby waited until the dust had swallowed them before she bent and picked up the paper. She read it twice. Her hands were steady this time. She'd used up all her shaking that morning. It's a lie, she said. Every line of it. I have the receipts. Thomas filed everything. Doesn't have to be true. Caleb's voice was quiet, and certain the voice of a man who'd watched this done before. Just has to be filed. He files the lie, you spend 30 days proving it's a lie, and while you're running to the county seat and back, he's got your water shut off, and your cattle dying, and the town saying you're finished. By the time you win the paper fight, you've lost the ranch anyhow. He looked at her. That's how he took the last one. The widow you told me about. Her name was Ruth Calloway. Caleb said it like it cost him. She won her paper fight. Took her 4 months. She came home to a dead herd and a burned-out barn and a bank that called her note all the same. She signed the land over to him on the courthouse steps the day after she'd proved in court that he had no right to it. He took his hat off, turned it in his hands. She didn't fight him after that. Some folks say she just stopped. I knew her some. She didn't stop. She broke. The word hung in the air between them. I won't break, Abby said. No, ma'am. Caleb looked at her a long moment. I don't believe you will. That's the trouble. He doesn't either. And a man like Rourke, when he meets a thing he can't bend. He stopped. He doesn't bend it. He burns it. Abby was about to answer when an old voice came up the road accompanied by the uneven thump of a walking stick against hard-packed dirt. Who's burning what now? Jonah Reed came around the gatepost on his bad leg. Hat pushed back the white stubble on his jaw, catching the last of the light. He'd worked for Thomas before Thomas died, and he'd come around now and again, since never asking for wages Abby couldn't pay. Just fixing what he could, and sitting on the porch and pretending he wasn't keeping an eye on her. Tonight his old face was set hard. Heard there was a parade out here this morning, Jonah said. 200 head of trouble and Silas Rourke at the front of it. Figured I'd best limp on over. His eyes went to Caleb, narrowed, took the measure of him in one long look. You're Rourke's man. Was, Caleb said. Jonah didn't soften, but he didn't reach for the old pistol on his hip either. Lot of was going around tonight. He turned to Abby. Tell me straight, girl, how bad? So she told him. The water lease, the 30 days. The men still posted at the corner of the property by her well. And then because Jonah had worked this land and earned the truth, she told him the rest. The brand, the stories from west of the Pecos. The water Thomas always swore was under the East 40. Jonah was quiet a long time when she finished. Then he sat down heavy on the porch step and rubbed his bad knee. I'll be damned, he said softly. Thomas was right. All them years everybody laughed at him for buying scrub, and the man was sitting on the only wet ground in the county. He shook his head. And now Rourke knows it. Now Rourke knows it, Abby agreed. Then he won't wait 30 days. Jonah looked up at her, and there was no comfort in his face, just an old man's plain, hard honesty. You understand that he's filed the paper to keep the law lazy and the town scared. But a man doesn't dig a well on land he hasn't got. He needs you off. Fast. Before some judge with a conscience gets curious about why the richest man in Texas wants a widow's scrubland. He spat into the dirt. He'll push. Tonight, tomorrow, this week. He'll push till you run, or till he's got cause to say you ran. Then I won't give him cause, Abby said. And I won't run. Easy to say on a full barrel. Jonah jerked his chin at the men sitting their horses out by the well-dark shapes now against the failing light. How long's your water last with them counting every bucket and the county fixing to call your well a crime? Abby didn't have an answer for that. None of them did. And the silence that followed was the first time that day she let herself feel how thin the rope had gotten. It was full dark when the boy came. He came on foot from the back of the property, the way a boy comes when he doesn't want to be seen on the road, and the stallion heard him before any of them did. The horse's head came up, sharp ears forward, and Caleb had the rifle off the porch and was moving before Abby could speak. But it was only Tommy Hale, 19, and skinny as a fence rail, breathing hard, holding his hat to his chest, like he'd come to a funeral. "Mrs. Whitaker?" His voice cracked on it. "Mrs. Whitaker, you got to know what they're saying in town." "Slow down, Tommy. Catch your breath. They're saying you stole that horse. Rourke's got it all over town that you took stolen stock, and that's why nobody's to sell to you. Bart at the feed store won't carry you no more," says Rourke. "Told him you're a bad debt now. The blacksmith says he's too busy to fix your gate. But I seen his forge, cold ma'am. It ain't busy. He's just scared." The words tumbled out of him. "And the sheriff's telling folks it's a county matter, and to stay clear, and Rourke's offering money to anybody who'll swear they saw your cattle on his side of the line. $5 a man just to put their name to it." $5, Jonah muttered. "In a drought year, he'll have a dozen liars by morning. That ain't all." Tommy looked behind him into the dark, then back and dropped his voice. "I wasn't supposed to come. My pa works for Rourke. He'd skin me if he knew. But He stopped, his throat working. "You let my ma have eggs on credit 2 winters ago, when my pa was laid up. Didn't write it in no book. Just gave them to her. I ain't forgot." He stood up straighter, this scared poor skinny boy, and looked her in the eye. "So I'll say it plain. I don't believe you stole that horse, and I'll work for you. For nothing if it comes to it. I had to come tell you that somebody believes you. Before they get the whole town saying you're a thief." Abby found she couldn't speak for a moment. "That horse'll get you killed, son," Jonah said gruffly. "Your pa works for the man who wants it." "Then I reckon I picked the wrong pa." Tommy didn't back down. "But I picked the right side." And Caleb, who had been standing in the dark with the rifle saying nothing, made a low sound that might have been the start of a laugh and might have been something else, and lowered the gun and said, "Boy's got more spine than most grown men I rode with." It should have been a small comfort. A boy, an old man, a stranger. But Abby felt something steady under her for the first time since dawn, and she understood standing there in the dark that Silas Rourke had made one mistake already. He'd told the whole county she was alone. And in doing it, he'd shown every soul who'd ever owed her a kindness exactly where to find her. That was when the rock came over the back fence. It thudded into the dirt, not 10 feet from where they stood, and Caleb spun with the rifle, and Tommy yelped, and Abby's heart slammed into her ribs, and then she saw the rag tied around it white in the dark, and the corner of paper underneath. "Don't shoot, don't shoot!" A boy's voice younger than Tommy's from somewhere out past the fence in the black. "It's a message. I'm just the one carries it. Don't shoot." "Show yourself," Caleb called. "Can't miss her. They'd know who told." A pause. "She's to read it. Just her." And then the soft, fast patter of bare feet running gone before Caleb reached the fence. Abby knelt and untied the rag. The paper inside was folded small, the writing on it cramped but clear, written by someone who didn't waste words. She read it once to herself. Her face changed. She read it again. "What is it?" Jonah leaned in. "Girl, what's it say?" Abby's voice came out low and strange. "It says..." She looked up toward the dark ridge to the north, though there was nothing to see. "It says the horse knows where he's safe. Don't trade him for a promise from a man who profits off thirst. We've been watching since the dust came up. We'll be watching when it settles." She turned the paper over. There was one more line on the back. She read it slowly. You are not the first widow he's come for. You can be the last." The silence that fell over the four of them was absolute. "Ruth Calloway," Caleb said hoarsely. "They know about Ruth." "Who?" Tommy whispered. "Who's watching, ma'am? Who wrote it?" Abby was already moving out from under the barn eave into the open yard, looking north into the dark, where the ridge cut a black line against the stars. And she saw them. Just for a moment. Shapes on horseback, still as carved stone strung along the high ground above her land. A dozen, maybe more. Watching the way the note said. They'd been there all day. Maybe since before the dust came up that morning. Watching Silas Rourke surround her. Watching the buckboard come and go. Watching a boy throw a rock over her fence. "Caleb." Her voice didn't shake, but it was close. "Who are they?" Caleb came and stood beside her and looked up at the ridge a long time before he answered. "The brand on that horse," he said quietly. 3 lines to a point. "I told you the families west of the Pecos run free horses." He let out a slow breath. "There's one family carries that mark. Folks call them the Crow Riders. They don't sell horses, and they don't take sides, and they sure as hell don't come east of the Pecos for nothing." He looked at her. "If they're sitting on your ridge, ma'am, it's because that black stud is theirs, and they want him back. The question I can't answer is whether they came to help you or just to wait you out and take him once Rourke's done breaking you." Abby looked from the ridge to the barn where the stallion's eyes caught the lantern light, calm now, watching her the way he'd watched her from the first. "He came to me," she said. "Out of the whole empty world he came to my gate." She set her jaw. "If they wanted him back, they could have taken him any night since. They didn't. They waited to see what I'd do." "And what'll you do?" Jonah asked. Abby was quiet. She thought about Thomas in the dry creek bed. She thought about the receipts in the trunk that proved the lease was paid, that would do her no good for 4 long months while Rourke bled her dry. She thought about Ruth Calloway, who'd won her paper and lost her soul on the courthouse steps. And she thought about a starving horse that had chosen her, and a boy who'd walked 3 miles in the dark to say somebody believes you. "I've got 3 roads," she said slowly. "I can hand over the horse and live a little longer with my head down. I can sell to Rourke and walk off my husband's land with whatever he decides to leave in my hand." She turned and looked at the 3 of them, the old man, the boy, the stranger. "Or I can stand. With a wounded horse and the 4 of us and people on a ridge, I don't know if I can trust." "That's not 3 roads," Caleb said. "No, no ma'am." He met her eyes. "You already chose. You chose at the gate this morning when you told Rourke which one of you was the fool. The only question left is whether you'll let us stand with you or try to do it alone like you've done everything else for 2 years. He paused, and his voice gentled. "And I'll tell you plain, you do it alone. He wins. He's been winning against people standing alone his whole life. It's the only thing he knows how to beat." Abby looked at him for a long moment. "All right," she said. "Then we don't stand alone." She'd barely finished saying it when the sound came from the road. Hoofbeats. One horse ridden hard fast, careless of the dark, and Caleb had the rifle up again and pushed Abby behind him with one arm, and Jonah was up off the step with the old pistol, and Tommy grabbed a pitchfork off the barn wall with hands that shook. The rider came into the lantern light at a dead run and hauled up so hard the horse near sat down. It was a town man. Abby knew his face, Hollis, who clerked at the county recorder's office, a soft, frightened man who'd never done a brave thing in his life. He was hatless, gray in the face, and he could barely get the words out for the fear of them. "Mrs. Whitaker," he gulped air. "Mrs. Whitaker, I shouldn't be here. God help me. I'll lose my place, but I had to. I saw what came across my desk tonight." "Easy, Hollis." Abby came out from behind Caleb. "What did you see?" "Rourke filed it not 2 hours ago." Hollis's hands were white on the reins. "It ain't just the water lease. He's filed a claim of abandonment. Says the East 40's been left untended and unworked these 2 years since your husband died. Says under the statute, untended land reverts to whoever's been improving the adjacent ground." His voice broke. "And he's filed the survey to prove it. Dated this spring. Says his men have been running cattle on your East 40 for a year and a half, and you never once contested it." He swallowed. "Ma'am, if a judge signs it, and Rourke's judge will sign it, you don't have 30 days. The hearing's set for the day after tomorrow at noon. He's taken the East 40 in 2 days, and there's nothing in the law to stop him, because on paper, it's already his." The words landed like the rock over the fence. 2 days, not autumn, not 30 days. 2 days. "That's a lie," Jonah snarled. "Rourke's cattle never ran on that land. I worked it. I'd have seen—" "It's filed," Hollis whispered. "It's stamped and dated and witnessed. 3 men swore to it this evening. I saw their marks." He looked at Abby with the wretched eyes of a coward who'd found just this once half a spine. $5 a man, they say. He's got his witnesses. He's got his survey. He's got his judge. The hearing's a formality. He gathered his reins. "I came to tell you so you'd have your 2 days. It's all I can do. God forgive me, it's all I dare." And he wheeled his horse and was gone back down the dark road as fast as he'd come. The 4 of them stood in the lantern light, and nobody spoke. 2 days. To prove the East 40 had been worked. To break a survey Rourke had paid to forge. To find 3 honest men against 3 bought ones in a town that wouldn't sell her flour. With her water cut her credit dead, and the richest man in Texas counting her buckets from the corner of her own land. Abby walked to the barn. The stallion turned his head and watched her come. She put her hand on his neck and felt the warm life under the wounded hide, and she thought of everything that hung now on 2 days, and a horse she didn't fully understand, and riders on a ridge who might be friends, or might be vultures. "All right," she said, so quiet only the horse could hear. "All right. If they want this land, they're going to have to prove I left it. And I never left it. Not one day. Not even when I wanted to lie down in that creek bed beside him and never get up again." Her hand tightened on the stallion's mane. "Thomas knew what was under here. He died not telling a soul but me. And I'm not going to let Silas Rourke dig my husband's grave a second time." She turned to the others. "Jonah, Thomas kept every paper he ever signed in the cedar trunk under our bed. Surveys the deed, the lease receipts, all of it. We need it sorted before sunup." "Already going," Jonah said, and was. "Tommy, can you ride to the county seat and back before that hearing without being seen?" "Yes, ma'am." "No hesitation. Then I'll have a letter for you by morning. There's a circuit judge rides outside Rourke's county. Caleb knows the name." She looked at Caleb. "Don't you?" "Judge Aldous Tate," Caleb said slowly. "Rode his court once. He's the one judge in 300 miles Rourke's money never reached. But he's old and he's slow, and the day after tomorrow's noon is awful close, ma'am." "Then Tommy rides tonight." Abby's voice was iron now. "Not tomorrow. Tonight." And it was right then, in that moment, when something like a plan had just taken shape, when the 4 of them had for the first time stopped reacting and started fighting back, that Tommy looked past her shoulder toward the north fence and went white as the rag the message had come wrapped in. "Mrs. Whitaker," he whispered. "The men, Rourke's men, by the well." He pointed with a shaking hand. "They're gone." Abby turned. The corner of her property where the watchers had sat their horses all evening counting every bucket was empty. Dark. Still. "When did they leave?" Caleb's voice had dropped low and dangerous. "Tommy, when—" "I don't just now, I wasn't watching, I was—" The boy's voice climbed. "Why would they leave? They've been there all day. Why would Rourke pull his men off the well in the middle of the night unless—" He didn't finish it. He didn't have to. Because every one of them was thinking the same thing, and out on the dark ridge to the north, the silent shapes of the Crow riders had begun one by one to move. Caleb moved first. "Inside," he said. "All of you. Now, lantern out." He had Abby by the arm, steering her toward the house, the rifle already up. "Tommy, get that pitchfork down. You pointed at a Crow rider in the dark. They'll put an arrow through your throat before you blink." "Arrows," Tommy squeaked. "What kind of men use the kind that don't miss?" Caleb killed the lantern with a breath, and the yard went black. "Jonah, the trunk papers can wait. Get to the barn door and don't let that horse hear you coming, or he'll call out and tell every soul on that ridge exactly where we're standing." But Jonah didn't move toward the barn. He'd planted his stick and was staring north, and his old voice came out flat and certain in the dark. "They ain't coming for us," he said. "Jonah, use your eyes, boy. They're not riding down. They're riding across." Jonah pointed with his stick. "Strung out west to east along the ridge line. That's not a charge. That's a man putting a fence between two things." He turned his head and spat. "They're getting between us and wherever Rourke's well-men went." For a long moment, nobody breathed. Then Caleb let out a slow sound, half relief and half dread. "They're covering us," he said. "Lord, they're not after the horse. They're guarding the north line." "From what?" Abby's voice was tight. "Caleb, Rourke pulled his men off my well in the dead of night. Men don't quit a post like that unless they've got somewhere better to be." She was already thinking it, already saying it. "He didn't pull them off to go home and sleep. He pulled them off to do something. Tonight. Before the hearing. Something he doesn't want witnessed." "The East 40, Jonah said grimly. "If a man wanted to prove he'd been working land he never touched, what's the first thing he'd want gone?" He answered his own question. "Any sign you'd been working it instead. Your fence posts, your watermarks, your husband's old survey stakes still standing out there with the Whitaker brand burned in them." "He's going to tear out my markers," Abby breathed. "Tonight, so that when the judge's man rides out tomorrow there's nothing on that ground but Rourke's stakes and Rourke's lies. And the Crow Riders know it." Caleb was already moving for the door. "That's why they're stringing the ridge. They're putting themselves between Rourke's wreckers and the East 40. He grabbed his hat. "Saddle up. If there's still markers standing out there at sunup, you've got proof. If there's not, you've got nothing, and that hearing's over before the gavel drops." "Caleb." Abby caught his sleeve. "You ride out there in the dark toward armed men and Crow Riders who don't know your face, and somebody's going to die over a fence post. Somebody's going to die over a sight more than a fence post before this is done." He stopped, and his voice dropped. "But you're right. We don't ride blind into the middle of it." He turned to the boy. "Tommy, you said you can move across this country without being seen. Can you get to that ridge and tell whoever's leading those riders that the woman they're protecting wants to talk, not fight before somebody starts a war in the dark?" Tommy's throat bobbed. "They'll shoot me." "They might." Caleb didn't lie to him. But a boy on foot with his hands up reads different than four riders coming hard. And you're the only one of us they might believe. Tommy looked at Abby. And Abby, who'd sworn she'd never again let somebody else's child carry her burden, looked at this skinny boy who'd walked 3 miles in the dark to say he believed her and hated what she had to do. "You don't have to," she said. "No, ma'am," Tommy said. "I reckon I do." He set the pitchfork against the wall, careful like it mattered. "My ma always said the only thing worse than being scared is being scared and doing nothing." He pulled his hat down. "I'll tell them you want to parley. That's the word, ain't it, parley?" "That's the word," Caleb said quietly. And the boy slipped out the back and was swallowed by the dark, and the 3 of them were left to wait, which is the hardest thing there is. The waiting broke just before the first gray came into the east. It broke with a single rider coming down off the ridge, not toward the house, but angling toward where Tommy had gone. Slow, deliberate hands held wide of the body. And walking beside the horse alive was Tommy, talking fast, and the rider was listening. Abby was off the porch before Caleb could stop her. The rider reined up at her fence. It was a woman. Gray ran through her dark hair like silver wire, and her face was the kind the sun and the years had carved down to nothing but the truth of it, and her eyes, even in the half-light, missed nothing. She looked at Abby a long moment. She looked at the rifle in Caleb's hands and dismissed it. She looked last and longest at the barn, where the stallion had come to the door, and stood with his ears forward, and his whole body pointed at her like a needle finding north. "So," the woman said, "he chose this gate." Her voice was low and dry. "Out of every fence between here and the river he chose yours. She studied Abby. "You know what that horse is, woman?" "I'm starting to," Abby said. "I don't know what you are, or whose side you're on." The corner of the woman's mouth moved. Not a smile, the memory of one. Martha Crow. She said it like it ought to mean something, and to anybody west of the Pecos it did. "And I'm on the side of the only person in this valley who fed that stud instead of trying to sell him." Her eyes hardened. "Your name's Whitaker." "Abigail." "Abigail." Martha nodded once. "Your fence posts are still standing, Abigail. All of them. Your husband's survey stakes, too." She let that land. Rourke sent 8 men with axes and pry bars to pull them at midnight. They got within 100 yards of the East 40 before they found my riders sitting on it. There was some shouting. There was no shooting. Rourke's men do their brave work against widows, not against people who shoot back. Contempt dripped off the word. They went home. Your markers stand. For now. The relief that went through Abby was so sharp it was almost painful. "For now," she repeated. "For now." Martha swung down off her horse, slow, and stood there small and weathered, and somehow filling the whole yard. "I'll tell you what I told that boy. I've been watching this valley a long time. I knew Ruth Calloway." Beside Abby, Caleb made a low sound. Martha's eyes cut to him. "I know you too, Mercer. I know what you did for Rourke when you were young and hungry and a coward. And I know you've been riding away from it for 6 years." She let that sit on him a moment, watched him take it. The horse came east because the water under this woman's land is calling to him. He can smell it from 40 miles. It's the only deep water left between here and the Pecos that Rourke hasn't poisoned, dammed, or sucked dry. Her jaw tightened. Rourke's been killing this country's water for 20 years to make every soul in it depend on his wells. And now there's one piece of ground left he doesn't own, and there's water under it, and it belongs to a widow he figures he can frighten off in a season. She looked at Abby. He figured wrong about Ruth too at first. He learned. He won't make the same mistakes. What mistakes did he make with Ruth? He gave her time. Martha's voice went flat as a blade. 4 months of paper fighting. Time enough for her to win in court and lose everything else. He won't give you time. That's why the hearing's the day after tomorrow instead of in the fall. She let the truth of it settle. He's learned that the trick isn't to beat you slow, it's to beat you before you understand you're in a fight. "Then why are you helping me?" Abby asked. "If you wanted the horse, you could have taken him any night. You sat that ridge and watched Rourke surround me, and you did nothing all day. Why move now?" For the first time, something in Martha Crow's hard face shifted. "Because all day," she said quietly, "we were watching to see what you were. We've helped widows before. Some of them folded the first hard night and signed everything over and blamed us for getting their hopes up. We don't risk our people for someone who's going to break." Her eyes held Abby's. "And then a boy with no shoes threw a rock over your fence, and instead of a frightened woman, we watched you walk out into the open dark and look up at us and not run." A pause. "You want to know why we moved tonight, Abigail Whitaker? Because tonight you stopped being a widow we were watching. Tonight you became a fight worth joining. And that, more than the markers still standing, more than the riders on the ridge, was the thing that put steel all the way down Abby's spine." "All right," she said. "Then here's where the fight stands." And she told Martha Crow everything. The water lease lie. The 30-day notice that no longer mattered. The abandonment claim. The forged survey dated this spring. The 3 bought witnesses. The hearing the day after tomorrow at noon before a judge Rourke owned. And Tommy, who was supposed to ride that morning for Judge Aldous Tate, the one honest judge in 300 miles. When she finished, Martha was quiet a long while. "Tate," she said finally. "I know the name. He's slow and he's old and he's deaf in one ear, and he is the only man who ever held a court in this territory that Rourke's money couldn't reach." She looked at the brightening east. "But the boy can't make the county seat and back before that hearing. It's near 60 miles. Not on the horses he's got." "Then there's no point," Caleb said heavily. We can't get Tate here in 2 days. I didn't say there was no point. Martha's eyes glinted. I said the boy can't do it. My riders can. We know the dry trails. We can do 60 miles in the time it takes Rourke's men to do 30, and we've got remounts staged from here to the river because that's how we live. She turned to Tommy. But you write the letter, woman, and you sign it, because Tate won't move for a stranger. And you'd best make it the truest thing you ever wrote, because we'll be killing horses to carry it. Abby looked at her. Why? Why spend your horses, your people, for my land? Because it isn't only your land. Martha's voice dropped, and for a moment the hardness left it, and something older and sadder came through. Rourke takes your water. He controls the last well between here and the river. He controls that my family can't run free horses through this valley anymore. 40 years we've run them through here. My grandmother ran them through here. She looked at the stallion, and the stallion looked back at her, and something passed between the woman and the horse that Abby felt but couldn't name. That stud is the last of a line that's found water in this country since before there was a Texas. Rourke gets your land, he gets the water, he gets the valley, and the horses stop coming through, and a way of living that's older than every fence in this county dies in a season. Her jaw set. So no, Abigail. I'm not spending my people for your land. I'm spending them for all of it. You just happen to be standing on the last piece worth fighting for. The letter was written before full light. Abby wrote it at the kitchen table with Caleb at her shoulder, feeding her the words of law, and Jonah laying out the trunk papers, the deed, the lease receipts dated and stamped Thomas's old survey with the Whitaker brand, the tax payments she'd scraped together every year alone. She wrote it plain, and she wrote it true, and she signed it with a hand that did not shake, and she folded into it a copy of the receipt that proved the water lease was paid in full, the lie at the heart of Rourke's whole house of cards. Martha took it, tucked it into her coat, and was on her horse before Abby could thank her. Don't thank me yet, Martha said. You've got 2 days to survive before any of this matters. And Rourke knows now that you didn't fold, and you didn't run. He'll have heard by sunup that his wreckers came home empty-handed. She gathered her reins. A man like that when frightening you doesn't work. She didn't finish it. She didn't need to. Keep that horse close. Keep your people closer. And whatever he offers you between now and that hearing, Abigail, and he will come to offer you something. Remember that the only reason he offers is because he's afraid you'll win. And she wheeled north and was gone, and 2 of her riders peeled off the ridge and went with her toward the river, and the rest stayed strung along the high ground watching. He came at noon. Of course he came at noon, the hour he'd set for the first deadline, the hour he meant to set for the last. But this time, he didn't bring 200 men. He brought 6. And a wagon with an iron transport cage on the back of it, big enough for a horse. And the thin man in the town coat with a fresh stamped paper. And Sheriff Doyle, who looked like he'd rather be anywhere on God's earth than at Abby Whitaker's gate again. Silas Rourke didn't get down this time. He sat his gray and looked at the markers still standing out on the East 40, and Abby watched him understand that his wreckers had failed, and she watched it cost him something behind the soft, mild face. Mrs. Whitaker. His voice was pleasant as ever. You've had a busy night. So have your axemen, Silas. Pity about all that walking for nothing. His eyes flicked to the ridge, to the riders strung along it, and back to her. You've made some interesting friends. Horse thieves and drifters. He nodded at Caleb. And turncoats. The word was a small, precise cruelty aimed to wound. Mercer. You crawled a long way to stand in a widow's yard. Does she know what you are? Does she know what you did for me out by the Calloway place with the cattle in the dark? She knows, Caleb said. His voice was rough, but it didn't break. I told her myself, told her all of it. That's the difference between you and me now, Silas. I had to say my sins out loud before a woman who could have shot me for them. You've never said a true word in your life that didn't have a price on it. Something flickered in Rourke's eyes. He covered it with a smile. Let's be reasonable. He gestured, and the thin man held up the paper. This is a final offer, and it's generous, and there's witnesses to say I made it. You hand over the black stud right now into that cage. You sign the East 40 over to me. And in exchange... He paused. You keep your house, the home parcel, the roof over your head. You'll be a tenant, not an owner, but you'll have a bed and a stove, and you won't be turned out into a drought to die." He spread his hands. "That's mercy, Mrs. Whitaker. That's more than you'll get from any judge. Take it." And here was the line. Abby felt it under her feet, like the edge of the dry creek bed where she'd found Thomas. One step, and there was no coming back. "And the water," she said. "Under the East 40, that goes to you." "The water's a fairy story, ma'am. Scrubland and old wives' tales." "Then why the cage, Silas?" She let her voice carry, so the 6 men and the sheriff and the thin man would all hear it. "Why the army yesterday, and the axemen last night, and the cage today, over land you say is worthless, and a horse you say is stolen? Why does the richest man in Texas lose sleep over a widow's scrub?" She took one step toward him. "You can't lie your way out of your own cage, Silas. You brought it because you know exactly what's under my land, and exactly what that horse can find. You've known for a year. That's the whole reason for all of it." The men shifted in their saddles. Doyle's eyes came up off the dirt for the first time. Rourke's smile was gone now. What sat in its place was the face Abby had seen for one breath at the gate the morning before the thing under the mildness cold and patient, and without a floor to it. "You're a foolish woman," he said quietly, "to say true things out loud in front of witnesses. Funny." Abby didn't back up. "That's near exactly what you said the first morning. Be careful what a widow says out loud." She looked him dead in the eye. "I've been careful for 2 years, Silas. Careful and quiet and small the way this whole town wanted me. And it got me a forged survey and an army at my gate. So I'm done being careful." Her voice rang across the yard. "You want the horse? Come take him. You want the land, come take it. But you'll do it in front of these men, and you'll do it in front of those riders, and you'll do it before a judge who isn't on your payroll because I sent for one last night and he's coming." The silence that followed was the loudest thing in the world. "You sent for a judge," Rourke repeated. Something had gone very still in him. "There's a hearing set for tomorrow, with a judge." "With your judge," Abby said. "I sent for a different one. Aldous Tate." She watched the name land, watched it go into Rourke like a blade, watched the 6 hired men exchange looks, because they knew that name too, and what it meant, and that there was exactly one judge in the territory their boss had never bought. "He'll be here, and he'll see the markers your men couldn't pull, and he'll read the lease receipt that says your back payment notice is a lie, and he'll hear from a man who'll swear before God and the law what you did to Ruth Calloway." And that was when the stallion screamed. It came out of the barn so sudden and so sharp, it split the noon wide open, a wild high cry that seemed to climb the air and hang there, the cry of an animal that had run 100 miles to a stranger's gate and would not be caged again. Every horse in the yard threw its head. Rourke's gray danced sideways, and out on the ridge, the crow riders moved as one easing down off the high ground, not charging, just coming slow and certain, until they sat strung along Abby's north fence with the sun behind them and their faces unreadable. Doyle looked at the riders. He looked at the markers still standing. He looked at Abby and at the cage and at the 6 hired men and at Silas Rourke. And the sheriff of the county, who'd never in his life had courage for anything but an ordinary day, found a small and trembling piece of it now. "Mr. Rourke," he said, I think maybe we ought to let the law sort this. Tomorrow. Like it's set." He swallowed. "I'm not arresting a widow over a horse with 24 witnesses watching and Judge Tate riding in. I won't do it. You can have my star if you want it, but I won't do it." For one long moment, Abby thought it was over. For one moment, she let herself believe. Then Silas Rourke laughed. It was a soft sound, almost gentle, and it was worse than any shout could have been, because it was the laugh of a man who had lost a hand and was already counting the cards still in the deck. "All right." He gathered his reins, calm as Sunday. "All right, Mrs. Whitaker. You want the law, you'll have the law. Tomorrow. Judge Tate, if your horse thieves can even get him here in time." He turned the gray slow, and his men fell in behind the cage wagon, and at the gate he paused and looked back at her, and the thing in his face had no bottom at all. "But the law's a slow thing," Silas said, "and summer's a fast one. Tate won't be here till tomorrow noon if he comes at all. That's a long night between now and then." He let it sit. "Wells go dry, Mrs. Whitaker. Fences burn. Cattle die in the dark, and nobody ever rightly knows how the fire started." He touched his hat to her courteous monstrous. "Folks change their minds about a lot of things when they wake up to smoke. You sleep well now, while you still can." And he rode out, and the cage wagon rolled after him, empty, and the dust closed over the road. Abby stood at her gate with her heart slamming, and the stallion still calling from the barn, and she understood with a cold and total certainty that she had won the day and lost nothing of the danger. She turned to Caleb and to Jonah, leaning hard on his stick, and to Tommy, white-faced, beside the barn, and to Martha's riders, sitting silent along her northern line. "He's not going to wait for the judge," she said. "He just told us. He can't beat Tate in a courtroom, so he's going to make sure there's nothing left worth Tate ruling on by the time Tate gets here." She looked north toward the East 40, toward the markers, and the dry brush, and the long open dark that was coming. "He's going to burn me out tonight." They had until dark, and they used every minute of it. "He'll come at the north fence," Caleb said, already pacing it off in his mind. "It's down in 3 places, it's dry brush for 100 yards, and the wind comes off the ridge at night. He sets it there, it runs straight at your barn and your house both." He turned. "Jonah, how many soaking sacks can we wet down before the well's drawn too low to fight a fire with?" "Not enough." Jonah's face was grim. "He's had us rationed all week. I can fill maybe a dozen sacks and keep the barrel for the worst of it. After that we're throwing dirt." "Then we throw dirt." Abby was already moving. "Tommy, you and Jonah cut fire break along the brush, scrape it down to bare ground 10 feet wide between the fence and the barn. If we can keep the fire from jumping the gap, the buildings live." "Ma'am, 10 feet of bare ground in what's left of daylight. Then start now and stop arguing." She didn't say it unkind. She said it the way Thomas used to, when there was no time left for anything but the doing. Tommy grabbed a hoe and ran. Martha Crow's riders did not leave. 4 of them came down off the ridge at dusk and put their horses in Abby's corral and took up positions she hadn't thought to ask for 2 at the north line, 1 at the well, 1 walking the dark perimeter on foot with a rifle across his arms. Their leader, a broad, quiet man Martha had left in command, found Abby in the yard. "Martha's most of the way to Tate's by now," he said. "If she kills 3 horses, she'll have him here by noon." He looked north into the gathering dark. "But Rourke knows that too, which means tonight he does everything he means to do because tonight's the last night he owns. We'll hold the line as long as there's a line to hold. After that," he shrugged, "after that we save what runs and let burn what burns. That's the truth of fire, ma'am. You don't beat it, you outlast it." Abby nodded. And then she did the thing she'd been dreading. She went to the barn. The stallion was already restless ears pinned, scenting the wind. He knew. Animals always knew before people did. "I have to make a choice about you," she told him low. "If they fire that brush and it runs, this barn's a death trap. I should turn you loose. Open the back gate, let you run for the ridge where you'll be safe." Her hand found his neck. "Caleb says you'll go straight to the Crow country and never look back, and that's likely the kindest thing I could do for you." Her voice caught. "But if I turn you loose tonight, Rourke wins the lie. He says you're stolen stock. You run off into the dark, and there's no horse to show the judge, no brand to prove the family's west of the Pecos, no living thing standing here that says I told the truth." She pressed her forehead a moment against the warm hide. "So I'm asking you to stay in a burning barn for me. And I hate it. I hate that I haven't got a better thing to ask." The stallion blew out a long breath and didn't pull away. She was still standing there when Caleb came in behind her, quiet on the straw. "You don't have to choose alone," he said. "That's the second time you've told me that. Reckon I'll keep telling you till you believe it." He came and stood by the horse by her. "We'll wet the barn down last and heaviest. We'll keep him in, but we'll keep a man on this door the whole night, And if the worst comes, we cut him loose and let the lie win, because a horse is a horse, and you are a person, and I'm not standing in a yard watching you run into fire for an animal." His voice roughened. "I did that once. Stood and watched. Out at the Calloway place, I stood and watched her barn go up, because Rourke told me to keep the men back, and I kept them back, and a year of her work and 3 good horses burned while I held the line for a man I knew was wrong." He swallowed hard. "I've heard those horses every night for 6 years, Abby. I'm not adding yours to them. You hear me, I'm not." It was the first time he'd called her Abby. Not ma'am, not Mrs. Whitaker. Just Abby, plain the way a man says a name when he's run out of room to hide behind anything else. She looked at him a long moment in the failing light. "All right," she said softly. "Then we keep a man on the door, and we don't burn for an animal. But Caleb," she held his eyes, "we don't run either, not from the land. Whatever burns we put it out, and whatever's left standing at dawn, we make sure the judge sees. Agreed?" "Agreed." He almost smiled. "You'd have made a hell of a foreman, Abby Whitaker." "I'm making a hell of a one right now," she said. "Go check the fire break." The fire came at midnight. It came exactly where Caleb said it would, the north fence 3 places just far enough apart to split their force 3 ways. The first they knew of it was the Crow rider on the perimeter firing a shot into the air, and then the smell, and then the low orange glow climbing up out of the dark, where there should have been nothing but black. North line. Caleb was already running. 3 fires, Tommy the west one go. Jonah hold the break by the barn. Don't you move off it, Abby. But Abby was running for the center fire, the biggest, the one set dead in line with the barn, and there was no stopping her. The next hour had no shape to it. It was only heat and smoke, and the screaming of frightened animals, and the sound of grown people sobbing for breath as they beat at flames with soaked sacks that dried out faster than they could be wet. Abby lost track of everything but the patch of fire in front of her. She beat it, and it spread, and she beat it again. The smoke turned the world to nothing. Somewhere, Tommy was shouting, his voice cracking, and somewhere a Crow rider was driving the cattle out of the path of the burn, and somewhere Caleb was a black shape against orange light dragging burning fence rail away from the dry grass with his bare hands. The wind shifted once hard and threw the center fire straight at the fire break, and Abby watched a tongue of it leap the bare ground toward the barn, and Jonah Reed. Old Jonah, with his bad leg, threw himself and 3 shovels of dirt at it at once, and went down hard, and got up and threw more and held it. Held the gap while the stallion screamed inside the barn, and Caleb wet the walls down, and the whole night hung on 10 feet of scraped earth, and one stubborn old man who wouldn't move off it. They held. It cost them. Abby's hands were burned across both palms where she'd grabbed wire that was hotter than she'd known. Caleb had dragged a panicked calf clear of the west fire, and collapsed after coughing black, and lay in the dirt a long minute before he could stand. Tommy had a long red wheal up one arm and didn't seem to feel it. But the barn stood, the house stood, the stallion lived, and as the gray came up and the last of the flames sank to smoking ruin, they stood in a row in the wreck of the north fence, filthy and scorched, and barely able to hold themselves upright, and they had won the night. That was when they found the man. A Crow rider called out from the burned brush, and they went to him, and there in the smoking dark, tangled in fallen wire, with a turned ankle and a can of coal oil still in his hand, was one of Rourke's men. He'd been caught by his own fire, when the wind shifted, gone down in the brush, couldn't run on the bad ankle. And Tommy Hale took one look at the man's face in the gray light, and made a sound like he'd been struck. "Pa," Tommy whispered. The whole world stopped, because it was Tommy's father, Rourke's man, caught in the act with the oil can in his hand, and the brand of the crime all over him, looking up at his own son, standing over him filthy from fighting the very fire he'd set. "Tommy." The man's voice shook. "Tommy, what are you? You ain't supposed to be here, boy. You ain't supposed to." "You said it." Tommy's voice was very young and very terrible. "You set fire to her land, to Mrs. Whitaker's land. She gave Ma eggs when you couldn't work, and you came in the dark, and you—" He couldn't finish. Pa, Rourke told me." The man was weeping now, the fight gone out of him the way it goes out of a small man caught doing a big man's cruelty. He said I'd lose the position. He said we'd lose the house, the boys, everything if I didn't. What was I supposed to do? You think I wanted? He held up the oil can like he hated it. I got 4 mouths to feed, and the only water in the county comes from Rourke's wells. He owns us, Tommy. He owns all of us. What was I supposed to do? And here was the twist that cut deeper than any forged paper, that Rourke's power wasn't just law and money. It was that he'd made fathers into arsonists by holding their children's water over the fire. It was that the man who burned Abby's fence was as much a prisoner as she was. Abby looked at the weeping man and at the boy standing over him with his whole heart breaking, and she made a choice that surprised even her. "Get him up," she said quietly. "Bind that ankle. Give him water." And when the Crow Rider stared at her, "Not Rourke's water, mine. From my barrel that he just tried to burn me out of." She crouched down by the man, her burned hands held careful in her lap. "Mr. Hale, you set fire to my land tonight. And in about 6 hours, a judge who can't be bought is going to ride up that road. You can tell him Rourke ordered it. You can say it out loud in front of witnesses the way a man says a true thing when it finally costs him more to lie." She held his eyes. "Or you can hang for arson alone while Rourke sits in his big house and forgets your name. Those are your roads, same as mine were. I chose mine last night at the gate." She stood. "You've got till noon to choose yours." Tommy's father looked up at her and then at his son, and something broke in his face that had been holding a long time. "I'll say it," he whispered. "God forgive me. I'll say all of it." Judge Aldous Tate arrived at 11 an hour before Silas Rourke ever expected him on a horse Martha Crow had nearly killed to get him there. And the first thing the old judge saw as he topped the rise was a widow's burned-out north fence still smoking against the noon sky. He reined up. He was old and deaf in one ear, and slow the way Caleb had promised, but his eyes were sharp as a hawk's, and they went from the smoking fence to the markers still standing out on the East 40, to the scorched and bandaged people gathered in the yard. "Somebody," Judge Tate said in a voice like dry gravel, "had best tell me why I rode 60 miles through the night to find a fresh burned fence and a woman with her hands bound up in flour sacks." He climbed down stiff. "And it had best be the truth, because I've spent 40 years on the bench, and I can smell a lie at 100 paces, and this whole valley reeks of one." It did not take long after that. It did not take long, because Abby laid the papers before him on the porch boards, the deed, the lease receipts, stamped and dated the tax payments she'd made alone every year, Thomas's old survey with the Whitaker brand. It did not take long, because the survey stakes still stood out on the East 40 exactly where Rourke's wreckers had failed to pull them, contradicting his fresh-forged claim that the land had been his cattle's range for 18 months. It did not take long, because Tommy's father, white and shaking, told the judge in front of God and witnesses that Silas Rourke had ordered the fire, had ordered the wreckers, had paid him in fear, and threatened his children's water. And it did not take long, because Caleb Mercer took off his hat and stood in front of the one judge in the territory who'd believe him and told the whole truth about Ruth Calloway. He told it plain. He told it without sparing himself. He told how he'd driven cattle across a false line in the dark, how he'd held the men back while a widow's barn burned, how Rourke had used the exact same playbook, the forged survey, the bought witnesses, the rushed hearing the fire to steal everything Ruth Calloway had, and how he'd ridden away from it for 6 years and never once made it right. "Why are you telling me this, Mercer?" Tate asked. "You confessed to a crime helping me prove another man's. You'll answer for the Calloway business, you understand that?" "Yes, sir." Caleb's voice didn't waver. "I'd rather answer for it than carry it." He looked at Abby just once, then back at the judge. "A man's not only what he did when he was scared and young and hungry, Your Honor. I'd like to find out if he's also what he does when it finally costs him to tell the truth." When Silas Rourke rode up at noon at his hour to his hearing, expecting his judge, he found Aldous Tate already on the porch with the papers spread before him, the markers standing, the fire setter confessed, and a turncoat's testimony already sworn. Abby watched the exact moment Silas understood he had lost. It wasn't a large thing. It was a small thing. A stillness that came over the big, soft body on the gray horse, the way the mildness drained out of the face, and left nothing behind it but a cold and bottomless calculation that finally, for the first time in 20 years, came up empty. He looked at the standing markers. He looked at Tommy's father. He looked at Caleb. He looked at the one judge his money had never reached. And the man who had surrounded a widow with 200 riders sat alone on his horse and found there was no card left in the deck. "Your Honor," Silas began smooth, "this woman has gathered a pack of horse thieves and admitted criminals to Mr. Rourke." Judge Tate didn't look up from the papers. "In my 40 years, I have learned that when a powerful man's first word at a hearing is to slander everyone who showed up to testify, it is because he cannot answer a single fact." Now he looked up, and his old eyes were terrible. "I have a deed. I have stamped receipts that make your back payment notice a forgery, which is a crime. I have survey stakes standing where your sworn claim says they cannot be, which makes your survey a forgery, which is a crime. I have a man who will swear you ordered last night's fire, which is arson, which is a crime. And I have your own former hand confessing to a near-identical fraud at the Calloway property, which suggests to me a pattern Mr. Rourke and judges do dislike a pattern." He set the papers down. "You did not come here today to win a hearing. You came to take a widow's land, and you assumed the law would be too slow or too bought to stop you. You assumed wrong. The East 40 is hers. The water under it is hers. And you, sir, will be answering a great many questions before a great many courts, and not one of them will be in your county." It was not a gunfight that broke Silas Rourke. There was no shot fired. There was only an old man with a deed and a confession and a pattern and a widow, with her hands wrapped in flour sacks, who had refused 3 separate times to sign her soul away for temporary safety. The men who'd ridden for Rourke began one by one to find reasons they'd never really been with him. The sheriff found enough spine to put his hand on Rourke's bridle. And the most powerful man in the county rode away from Whitaker Flats not as a conqueror, but as a man with charges gathering behind him like crows over a dying thing. When the dust had finally settled, Abby stood in the wreck of her yard with her burned hands and her smoke-blackened face, and she found she could not quite make her legs carry her any farther. Caleb caught her arm, steadied her, didn't let go any quicker than he had to. "You held the line," he said quietly. "Every man in this county swore you'd fold, and you held the line." "We held it," Abby said. She looked at Jonah leaning gray-faced on his stick at Tommy, sitting in the dirt beside the father he'd helped bring to justice and to mercy, both at the Crow Riders, loosening their cinches in the ruined corral, at the Black Stallion, standing alive and whole in the door of the barn that still stood. "All of us. Together." Her voice broke just slightly on the last of it. "I haven't done a single thing together with another living soul in 2 years, Caleb. I forgot it was even possible." She wiped her face with the back of a bandaged hand and only smeared the soot. "Turns out it's the only way anything gets held at all." The recovering took longer than the winning had. Winning had taken 2 days, and a fire and a judge. Recovering took the rest of that summer, and it was slower work and quieter, and in some ways harder, because there was no army at the gate to push against anymore, only the long, ordinary labor of putting a broken place back together one fence post at a time. But it started the way most true things start, with a hole in the ground. It was Jonah who insisted on digging the well. 3 weeks after the fire, with his bad leg barely healed, the old man planted his stick out on the East 40, where Thomas's cattle had always drifted in the worst of the heat, and he said, "Right here." He always said right here. 40 years I've watched stock find water before men do, and that grass don't stay green over nothing. We dig here. "Jonah, your leg." "My leg can hold a shovel same as my arms can." He was already taking off his hat. "Girl, your husband died swearing there was water under this scrub, and the whole county laughed at him into his grave. I helped him buy this parcel. I'm not dying without knowing if he was right." He drove the shovel in. "Now are you going to stand there, or are you going to find out what Thomas Whitaker knew? They dug for 2 days. Tommy and Caleb and 2 of Martha's riders who'd stayed on taking turns in a hole that got deeper and darker and drier looking, until even Abby began to wonder if grief had made Thomas see water where there was only hope. And then, on the second evening, with the light going gold, and Abby standing at the lip of the hole with her arms wrapped around herself, Caleb's shovel came up wet. He held it up without a word. The mud on the blade caught the last of the light. And then, the bottom of the hole began slow at first, and then steady to fill. Nobody cheered. It was stranger than cheering. Abby went down on her knees at the edge of the well. Her husband had sworn was there, and she put her bandaged hand into the cool, dark water, rising up out of the ground. He'd died believing in. And she finally, after 2 years, let herself weep. Not for losing him, but for the terrible joy of him being right of the whole laughing county, being wrong of Thomas Whitaker reaching up out of his grave with a handful of water to prove it. "He knew," she whispered. "He always knew." "He knew," Caleb agreed, gentle kneeling beside her in the mud. "And you held it long enough for the rest of us to find out." The water changed everything. Not just for Abby, for the valley. Because here was a thing Silas Rourke had spent 20 years making sure no one understood. His power had never really been money or law or land. His power had been thirst. He owned the wells. He owned the only water in a dry country, and a man who owns the water owns every soul who needs to drink. That was how he'd made Tommy's father into an arsonist. That was how he'd made the feed store and the blacksmith and the sheriff into cowards. Not because they were bad men, but because they were thirsty men, and Silas held the cup. And now there was another well. Abby could have done what Rourke did with it. She could have charged. She could have made the town that turned its back on her come crawling hat in hand to buy water from the widow they'd written off. She'd be rich inside a year. Lord knew she'd earned the right to be hard. She thought about it on the porch one evening, turning it over, and it was Caleb who finally asked her straight. "You've gone quiet about the water," he said. 3 days now. What are you chewing on? What I owe and what I don't." Abby looked out toward the East 40, where the well now stood ringed in fresh stone. "Half this county let Rourke happen to me. Stood at my fence and wouldn't meet my eyes. The feed store, the blacksmith, the sheriff who told me not to make a war over a horse." Her jaw tightened. "I could make them pay for it now. I've got the only free water for 40 miles. I could be Silas Rourke with a kinder face." "You could." Caleb didn't argue it. "Reckon some would say you'd be in your rights." "Some would." Abby was quiet a moment. "But I'd be building the same thing he built. A whole valley bowing to whoever holds the cup. And the next time some widow's alone and somebody comes for her land," she shook her head, "it'd be my well they'd be threatening her with, my water that owned them." She turned to him. "Thomas didn't buy this land to own anybody, Caleb. He bought it because he loved it. And I'm not going to turn the thing he loved into a chain around this valley's neck." So she did the thing that no one in Mason County had ever seen done. She opened the well. Not for free, a place that runs on charity dies as sure as a place that runs on greed, but fair, and the same price for every soul who came, the rich man, and the poor man, and the widow alike, with no man's water, held over another man's children. And the first people she let draw from it were the very ones who'd turned their backs at her gate, the feed store man and the blacksmith, who came shamefaced and could not look at her. "Mrs. Whitaker," the feed store man started, "I want to say about the credit about—" "You want to say you're sorry?" Abby filled his barrel herself. "I know. The whole town wants to say it now that it's safe." She handed him the dipper. "I'll tell you what I told a man who tried to burn me out. You don't owe me an apology. You owe the next person who stands alone at a fence the courage you didn't have at mine." She met his eyes. "Pay it forward, not back. The water's the same price for everyone. Drink." And the man drank and wept a little, and Abby Whitaker became in that single dry summer something the county had never had before. Not the richest person in the valley, but the one who'd broken the thing that made men cowards. Silas Rourke fell, as Judge Tate had promised, before a great many courts in a great many counties. The forged survey was a crime. The false lease notice was a crime. The fire was arson, and Tommy's father swore to it, and 3 other hands swore to it once they saw which way the wind had finally turned. The empire that had taken 20 years to build came apart in a single season, because an empire built on thirst cannot survive. The day there's a second well. His lawyers found other clients. His bought men found other employers. The judge in his own county, suddenly afraid of the pattern Aldous Tate had spread before the territory found religion, and recused himself. But there was one reckoning left, and it was the hardest one, and it was Caleb's. Because Caleb had confessed. In front of a judge under oath, he had sworn to driving cattle across a false line and standing by while Ruth Calloway's barn burned. He'd done it to bring down Rourke, knowing it might bring himself down too. And the law, once it gets moving, does not pick and choose its sinners. The summons came in late August. Caleb was to answer before Judge Tate's court for his part in the Calloway fraud, 6 years gone. Abby found him on the corral fence the night before, not packing, just sitting the way a man sits when he's made his peace with losing. "You're not even going to fight it," she said. "Fight what?" Caleb didn't turn around. "I did it. I told the truth about doing it. A man can't confess and then complain when somebody listens." He was quiet a moment. "I knew this was coming the day I took my hat off in front of Tate. I made my choice with my eyes open, Abby. I'd make it the same again." "They could send you to prison." "They could." He finally looked at her, and his face was steady, and that steadiness was somehow worse than fear would have been. "Abby, I rode away from the Calloway place 6 years ago, and I never made it right. I let a man pay me to help ruin a widow, and I ran, and I've been running ever since, and the running's done. Whatever Tate hands me, it's less than I owe her. I'm not going to stand in your yard a free man on the back of her ruin." He looked down at his scarred hands. "That's not the kind of man I'm trying to be. Not anymore. Not since I walked up your road." And Abby understood, looking at him, that this was the whole of it, that the difference between Caleb Mercer and Silas Rourke was that one of them ran toward the bill when it came due, and the other spent his whole life dodging it. She understood that she had fallen somewhere in that long, terrible summer for a man who would rather lose everything honestly than keep it on a lie. And she understood she was about to lose him to the very honesty that had made her trust him. "Then I'm coming to the hearing," she said. "Abby, I'm coming, Caleb. You're not going to stand in front of that judge alone. Not while I'm drawing breath. I've spent 2 years learning what a loan costs, and I'll be damned if I let you pay it now." The hearing was the twist none of them saw coming. Because when Caleb Mercer stood up before Judge Tate to answer for the Calloway fraud, the door of the courtroom opened and a woman walked in. She was older than Abby Gray, and weathered and worn down by hard years, but she walked in with her back straight, and Caleb went white as bone when he saw her. It was Ruth Calloway, not broken the way the stories said, not vanished, alive. Martha Crow had ridden to find her the moment Caleb's confession reached the territory, because the Crow riders had kept track of Ruth all these years, the way they kept track of every widow Rourke had ruined, and they'd never told a soul. "Mrs. Calloway?" Judge Tate rose courteous. "You've come a long way." "I have." Ruth's voice was quiet, but it carried. She looked at Caleb a long, long moment, and Caleb could not meet her eyes, and the whole courtroom held its breath. "I know this man," she said. "He rode for Rourke when Rourke took my place. He drove the cattle. He held the line while my barn burned." She paused. "And he's the only one of them, the only soul in 6 years who ever stood up in a court of law and said out loud what was done to me." She turned to the judge. "Every other man who wronged me lied about it till the day Rourke fell. This one confessed when it could only cost him, when it brought no profit, when it put his own neck in the noose." Her voice didn't waver. "Your Honor, I came 300 miles to say one thing. I forgive him. And I ask the court to weigh the man who told the truth at his own expense against the boy who did wrong at another man's order, because they are not the same man, and I will not see the only one who ever owned what happened to me punished worse than the men who never did." Caleb broke then. 6 years of carrying it, and the woman he'd wronged crossed a courtroom and forgave him, and the strong, steady cowboy who'd faced down 200 riders put his scarred hands over his face and wept like the boy he'd been when he made the worst choice of his life. Judge Tate let the room be quiet a while. Then he spoke in his dry gravel voice. "In 40 years on this bench," he said, "I have sentenced a great many men, and I have learned that the law's purpose is not vengeance, but truth. This man's testimony brought down Silas Rourke, who had ruined a dozen families and would have ruined a dozen more. This man confessed a crime that would otherwise have stayed buried. And the woman he wronged has come of her own free will to ask mercy for him." He looked at Caleb. "Mr. Mercer, you will make restitution to Mrs. Calloway in labor and in coin over such time as the court directs. You will not see the inside of a cell, because a man who runs toward his sins is worth 10 who run from them, and I have no interest in teaching the next frightened young hand that confession is a fool's road." He brought down the gavel. "You are free to go. Go and be the man you've been trying to be. The court has seen enough today to believe you'll manage it." Caleb walked out of that courtroom a free man, and the first thing he did was go to Ruth Calloway and take off his hat and stand in front of her with nothing left to hide behind. "There aren't words, ma'am," he said. "There's no words for what you just did." "Then don't use words." Ruth almost smiled. "Use the years you've got left. That's the only apology that ever meant anything." She looked past him to Abby waiting at the door, and her almost smile deepened. "And son, don't waste them. I lost mine to Rourke. Don't you lose yours to your own guilt. That woman's been standing at that door this whole time like she'd stand there till the world ended. You go on now." The black stallion left them in the first week of September. There was no drama to it. That was the thing Abby would remember, that the horse who'd come to her in a thunderstorm half dead and brought 200 riders and a fire and a war down on her head, left in the gray quiet of an ordinary dawn without a sound. The back gate of the corral stood open. She never knew if she'd failed to latch it or if he'd worked it himself. The Crow riders said their horses could do such things. But the gate stood open and the stallion was gone, and his tracks led northwest toward the ridge and the open country beyond it. Tommy found them first and came running stricken. "Mrs. Whitaker, he's gone, the gate was open. I swear I latched it, I swear." "You latched it, Tommy." Abby stood looking at the tracks, and she found to her own surprise that her eyes were dry. He didn't need a gate left open. He never did. She crouched and touched one hoofprint in the soft dirt. He came here wounded and starving out of the whole empty world, and everybody Rourke, the town, even me at the start, everybody thought he came to be taken, to be caged or branded or sold or owned. She stood. But he never came to be owned. He came because there was water here, and a person who'd feed a dying thing without asking what it was worth. He stayed till the water was safe and the fight was won. She looked northwest where the tracks ran. And now he's gone to do the same somewhere else. That's not a loss, Tommy. That's just what he is. "You ain't even sad," Tommy said, wondering. "I'm not sad," Abby agreed, and was surprised to find it was true. "He was never mine to keep. I gave him a fence to heel behind. He gave me back the future Silas tried to steal. We're square, that horse and me. You don't grieve a thing that fair." Martha Crow came through Whitaker Flats one last time before the season turned on her way back to the river country, and she sat on Abby's porch and drank Abby's coffee and told her where the stallion had gone. "Seen near the dry settlement south of the Pecos," Martha said. "Folks there been losing stock to a 3-year drought. And then this black stud comes out of nowhere, runs ahead of the herds, leads them to seeps and tanks. Nobody knew were there." She sipped her coffee. "Same as he did for you. He finds the water. He finds the people who need it before they even know how to ask. And then he moves on." She looked at Abby with those eyes that missed nothing. "My grandmother used to say, there's always been a horse like him in this country. Maybe always the same one, maybe a new one each time. Comes to the ones who'd feed a dying thing for nothing. Never stays. You were lucky to have him a season, Abigail. Most folks go their whole lives and never feed the right horse." "I wasn't trying to be lucky," Abby said. "I just couldn't watch him die at my gate." I know. Martha set down her cup and rose to go. That's exactly why he came to you, and not to one of the 200 men who'd have sold him by noon. She put on her hat. You take care of that cowboy of yours. He's a better man than he thinks he is, and those are the only kind worth keeping. And she rode north, and the Crow riders folded in around her, and they were gone like weather the way they'd come. By the end of that summer, the East 40 was green. Not by magic. Honestly, the water had always been there. Thomas had known it, the stallion had found it. Abby had protected the truth of it long enough for the world to see. The grass came up thick where the cattle had always drifted, and the herd that had nearly died in the drought fattened on it, and the ranch that the whole town had sworn would be gone by autumn was by autumn the soundest piece of ground in Mason County. Abby hired Tommy full-time with real wages and a real bunk, and the boy who'd walked 3 miles in the dark to say, "Somebody believes you never had to wonder again where he belonged." His father, when the courts were done with him, came quietly to Whitaker Flats and asked for no forgiveness and no work, only the chance to help rebuild the fence he'd burned, and Abby let him because she'd learned from a horse that you don't measure a creature by the worst hour of its life. Jonah rebuilt the north fence stronger than it had ever been, every post set deep, and he didn't limp any less, but he stood a good deal straighter the way a man does when he's helped prove a dead friend right. And Caleb stayed. He stayed, but he stayed the right way for wages in the bunkhouse, working every day to earn an inch of trust at a time, never once trading on the war they'd survived together, or the thing that had grown quiet and certain between them, through a summer of hauling water and mending wire and eating supper in tired silence. He made his restitution to Ruth Calloway on the schedule the court set, and he did it without complaint, and Abby loved him a little more each time she watched him ride off to pay a debt. No one but his own conscience was still counting. On the last evening of that summer, Abby stood on her porch and watched the light go gold over land that was finally and entirely hers. The fence Tommy's father had burned ran whole again across the East 40. The well her husband had died believing in gave water to a whole valley that had once turned its back on her. The herd grazed. The ranch lived. Caleb came up the steps and stood beside her, hat in his hands, and for a while neither of them said anything because they'd reached the place where two people don't always need to. "I'm not going to ask you for your hand," Caleb said finally. "Not yet. Maybe not for a good while." He turned the hat. "You spent 2 years being told you were a thing to be taken, and I'm not going to be one more man who shows up with a claim on you, even a kind one. When I ask if I ask, it'll be a long time from now when there's no doubt left in either of us that it's a thing you're choosing and not a thing you're settling for." He looked at her. "I can wait. I've got nothing but time and a debt to work off and a powerful good reason to stay." Abby's throat went tight. "You're a strange man, Caleb Mercer." "I'm a slow one," he said. "There's a difference." A pause. "For what it's worth, ma'am, I watched you hold this line when every man in the county, me included at the start, figured you'd fold by the first hard night. You never folded, not once. Not at the gate with 200 riders, not at the fire, not in that courtroom." His voice roughened. "I don't reckon I've ever seen anybody braver." And Abby Whitaker, who had buried a husband and survived a fire, and faced down the richest man in Texas with nothing but a wounded horse, and the truth looked out over the land that was hers and said the most honest thing she knew. "I was scared the whole time, Caleb." She said it quiet. "Every single minute. The gate, the fire, the courtroom. I was scared right down to my boots the whole way through." Caleb was quiet a moment. Then he nodded slow, and something gentle and sure came into his weathered face. "That's usually what courage is, Abby," he said. "It ain't the not being scared. It's the holding the line anyway." She let that settle into her like water into dry ground. And then she looked out one last time over the East 40, going gold in the last of the light, over the standing fence, and the open well, and the green grass, and the whole hard-won future that a man named Rourke had tried to steal, and a horse with no name had helped her keep, and she understood finally and completely who she was. She was not Thomas Whitaker's grieving widow anymore. She was not Silas Rourke's easy target. She was not the woman the town had written off the thing to be taken, the land waiting to be claimed. All of that had burned away in one terrible summer and left behind something the fire could not touch. She was Abigail Whitaker, a rancher, a landholder, the woman who broke the thirst that ruled a valley. And on the night she'd found a dying horse at her gate, she had learned the only thing that ever truly mattered: that kindness is not weakness, that the smallest mercy can become the line that shows the whole world exactly who you are, and that a woman who refuses to sell her soul for safety does not lose everything. She keeps the only things worth keeping, and she keeps them standing tall in the summer light, and no man alive can ever take them from her again.